And now for the 5-minute concluding statement from Professor Noam Chomsky.
Well, I finally found something that Mr. Perle said that I agreed with. Our discussion so far has been relatively, at least, cool and abstract and antiseptic. We have not looked into the eyes of the victims, as is often the case, the terrorized peasants, the slum dwellers of El Salvador. They've been remote from our consciousness. The maimed victims of the forces we send out to attack soft targets of Nicaragua, the children with broken limbs in a Gaza hospital, a peasant woman trying to cook in the rain in the ruins of her home demolished in collective punishment in what Israel, with our aid, is turning into a vast concentration camp. Having just returned from the West Bank, and shortly before from Central America, these images do happen to be vivid in my mind. I haven't talked about them. I'd like to use these last few moments just to outline the radical shift in policy that I think American citizens should induce our government to undertake, and we have ways to do it. With regard to Nicaragua, I think we should follow the advice of the leading democratic figure in Central America, Jose Figueres, who was the founder of Costa Rican democracy. He returned recently from a trip to Nicaragua, which he described as an invaded country, and he called upon the United States to allow the Sandinistas to finish what they started in peace. They deserve it. For the first time, he said, Nicaragua has a government that cares for its people, one that was elected as freely as anyone else in Central America except for Costa Rica. He found a surprising amount of support for the government, he said, despite the destruction of the economy caused by U.S. terror and economic warfare. As is understood throughout the world, this is the reason why the United States government has been unable to convert its proxy army into a guerrilla force, despite the unprecedented support lavished upon them, vastly beyond anything available to authentic popular or guerrilla movements. We should put aside our reliance on violence and our defiance of international law. We should terminate our dedicated efforts to block peaceful settlement in Central America. We should offer large-scale reparations for recovery from the destruction for which we are responsible. With regard to El Salvador, we should listen to the Archbishop, who calls upon the government we established to accept the offer for negotiations on the part of the indigenous guerrilla forces and to halt what he calls the escalating terror of the death squads, as he now does. We should heed the church-based human rights organization that denounces the continuing state terror and describes Salvadoran society as, I'm quoting, affected by terror and panic, a result of the persistent violation of basic human rights, a society living under collective intimidation and generalized fear that accepts the frequent appearance of tortured bodies because basic rights, the right to life, has absolutely no overriding value for society. We should attend to the recent polls taken by the Jesuit University of San Salvador, which show that 95% of the population prefer economic and humanitarian aid over military aid of any kind, and that 75% oppose both of the political parties that are permitted to function under U.S.-backed state terror called your democracy. The same is true with regard to Guatemala and Honduras, which, like El Salvador, remain under effective military rule behind a thin civilian facade which is erected primarily to extort money from Congress for the benefit of the wealthy and the privileged. In the Middle East, we should reverse our policy of unswerving rejectionism. We should join the very broad international consensus favoring a political settlement with a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza within a regional settlement, with the Palestinians permitted to select their own representatives for negotiations. That means the PLO, which has every bit as much legitimacy as the Zionist organization did in 1947. More generally, we should have the courage and the honesty to face some truths about ourselves and what we do in the world, even if those are unpleasant truths. We should ask why the United States rejects the World Court decision calling on it to refrain from the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua, why we veto resolutions at the United Nations Security Council calling on all states to observe international law, and why we repeatedly stand alone, or almost alone, in the General Assembly on issues of peace, disarmament, and observance of law. We should ask why we have consistently sought to remove conflicts from the arena of politics and diplomacy to the arena of violence where we can hope to prevail. We should ponder the meaning of the fact that, as studies have repeatedly shown, U.S. foreign aid correlates closely with torture and egregious human rights violations and not with need, that it has been used for a form of development that leaves the majority of the population in greater misery and destitution. We might even consider the advice offered over 20 years ago by Marine Commandant David Shoup, who said with regard to Vietnam that the best contribution we can make to its people is to get our bloody dollar-crooked hands out of their affairs. And if we can achieve this much, we should consider how we might begin to play a constructive role in the lives of miserable and suffering people throughout the world, instead of treating them as instruments to serve our purposes, or more accurately, the purposes of those elite groups that shape U.S. policies in their interests, not yours or mine. We should consider how the fear of the Soviet Union has been exploited to gain support for intervention in terror, just as fear of the United States has been exploited to similar ends by our global adversary. And we should ask what we can do to reverse this system of tacit cooperation in global oppression. We should begin to raise some fundamental questions about ourselves and our institutions and ask how they can change so they can become responsive to our true interests, which are not different from those who suffer at our hands. By world standards, we happen to be very free of state and other coercion, and that means that we have means available to learn about ourselves and to act to reverse a course that has brought us shame and has plunged many others into misery. We cannot appeal to fear of repression if we fail to undertake such efforts, but only to selfishness and cowardice. More than any other power, we have the resources to contribute to freedom, human rights, and social and economic development, just as we have the power to destroy and oppress, which is just what the United States government will continue to do if its citizens choose the easy path of obedience and apathy. Ample opportunities are open to us. Our willingness to make use of them will determine the fate of many millions of suffering people in the world, ultimately our own as well.
Thank you. I think it's important to ask a question at this point in our evening together as to what the purpose of dialogue is in the academy. And perhaps the important thing to bear in mind is to be clear what it's not. We in the American society are accustomed to sport events where we go and root for our favored side. Watch the boxer lay a glove on his opponent. Certainly that cannot be the purpose of dialogue and debate in the academy. Instead, our commitment is to invite thoughtful people to lay bare for us alternative visions of our world and how we relate to it. And then, with that sharpened relief, to engage in a thought process ourselves as to indeed the kind of role we wish to play. I think it's noteworthy to observe that both of our speakers urged us tonight to observe the world, to go out and find out for ourselves how it is, and to check what we see with our own preliminary judgments. So, in the spirit of contributing to that exercise, I want to thank both of our speakers, Mr. Richard Perle, Professor Noam Chomsky, for being with us tonight and on behalf of the School of Reese Lecture Committee and our student co-sponsors, good night.